I am going to try and cover 100 years in half an hour, which is somewhat ambitious, but I believe that the decisions made in the early years of the British Psychological Society have had a lasting effect on the BPS's perception of itself, its role, and whether it could or should interact with the public. The story I'm going to tell can be summarised as a series of different arguments and relationships, some of which we've already covered in some earlier talks. Psychologists versus psychiatrists, or medical psychologists as they were known at the time. Academic versus applied versus social psychologists, which I'm going to come to later in my talk. Psychologists as the institution of the BPS versus psychologists as individuals, and the psychologists and the public and the press perception of that. Okay, so on the 24th of October 1901, 10 people formed a psychological society, and the aim was to advance scientific psychological research and to further cooperation of investigations in the different branches of psychology. Their backgrounds ranged from philosophy, religion, physiology, anthropology and education. 4 of the 10 were medically qualified. Despite the infancy of the profession in the UK at the time, it was agreed that only those who were recognised teachers in some branch of psychology who had published work of recognised value be eligible as members. By this strict criteria, the founders wanted to differentiate themselves from Earnshaw, the historian of British psychology, described as commercially interested persons who were running courses or self-help books but who had no recognised qualifications. Another historian, Matthew Thompson, has written that psychology for much of this period was located on either side of the divide. For some, a science whose ambitions had to be contained if it was to justify such a status. For others, a key to making sense of everything, a source of values for a new age. There were other issues to overcome in the positioning of the society. Even the very term psychology was used by multiple groupings. The Royal College of Psychiatrists was known at the time as the Medical Psychological Association. Mediums and spiritualists often described themselves as psychologists, and there were also overlaps from the members of the Psychological Society and the Psychoanalytic Society. Some founder members were ambivalent at best about the latter. James Sully, who called the original meeting, wrote in 1919, "Recently the Society has suffered and survived an invasion by the psychoanalysts. Ward and Stout, for the moment, have been eclipsed by Freud and Jung." The new society was ambitious but inward-looking. A suggestion in 1911 that notices of their meetings should be circulated to other learned societies was rejected by the Executive Council. However, its narrow membership criteria, mentioned earlier, resulted in a lack of enough people joining to make the society viable. There were just very few people employed to teach psychology and not many appropriate journals to publish their research. By 1918, membership totalled 98, and although members were held around the country, the average attendance was 25, and new members were often personal contacts. The Society wanted its own publication for its research and planned to take over and run the existing, from 1906, British Journal of Psychology, and that required funds. Charles Myers, the editor of the journal, who was medically qualified himself, proposed that general membership was open to those who were interested in psychology, together with the parallel creation in 1919 of specialist sections for industry, or occupational psychology, medical psychology, and educational psychology. These two offerings resulted in increased membership by 1920, just a year later, of 631. The largest grouping being the medical section. Lovey has analysed these early medical section members and noted that 250 were medically qualified ex-servicemen, probably psychiatrists and some psychoanalysts, and very few of them actually met the section membership criteria of the teaching experience and publications. At the inaugural meeting of the industrial section, reported in the Times, Myers tried to spin the opening of general membership, claiming that with the development of the science, there has not been the same necessity for avoiding cranks as formerly. The spirit of openness to gain new general interest members led to a short-lived flurry of reports of the Society in the press. In 1919, there were four, including a report on the restoration of memory by hypnotism of a gunner who had been knocked out at Ypres. However, the mentions of the BPS in the Times up to 1939 in this graph were predominantly reports of joint meetings with other organisations who were not so adverse to public reporting of their affairs. For example, the annual conference of educational associations, at which the BPS education section routinely ran a session. The Society made no official efforts to explain psychology to the non-member public, and reports were strictly for members only, though obviously some transactions were published in the British Journal of Psychology, but it had a strictly limited academic circulation. Looking back, a member commented that despite the practical work by psychologists during the First World War, when it came to post-war civilians, and I doubt if in the early days of the Society, many psychologists thought of themselves as particularly useful in the narrow sense of the word. The popular interest in rumour, class feeling, taste, fashions, and their deliberate manipulation, conflicts and wars, national prejudices, subjects which the man in the street might be forgiven to be assuming to be the distinctive study of psychologists, was not shared inside the universities. The Manchester Guardian covered the 1937 BPS annual conference, and although the Society felt, I quote, lucky that no adverse consequence or misrepresentation ensued, it was shortly afterwards formally agreed the reports of BPS meetings were not to be reported in the press. And although this is very much an institutional, organisational history based upon the BPS's own archives, as in any membership organisation, it's often about the individuals. And I want to talk about the influence of one psychologist and two non-psychologists in the post-war public face of the Society. And in doing so, I want to widen the story from newspapers and articles into psychologists' relationship with the new media of the 20th century, radio and television. The three people are Tom Pear, an academic psychologist who, amongst other things, was a pioneer in social psychology, Frederick Laws, a journalist and arts critic, and Stephen White, a PR man who is a member of the Society's staff between 1985 and 2010, professionalised the Society's communication function, laying the foundations of its 12-strong team today. Thomas Pear was a protege of Charles Myers, and in 1909 was one of the earliest UK psychology graduates. In 1919, he was appointed the first professor of psychology in England. During the First World War, he had written Shell Shock and its Lessons, as well as selecting and training the first submarine listeners. This was the beginning of a lifelong interest in the psychology of sound and voices. In 1924, Pear carried out an experiment with the agreement of the BBC, who broadcast 9 people, illustrated in this photograph. The lady in the middle at the end, that is his daughter, 9 people reading the same passage of Dickens, and 4,000 listeners wrote in with their impressions based upon those voices, later published by Pear in his 1931 book, Voice and Personality. Pear was invited in 1937 to attend the early TV transmissions at Crystal Palace, having been commissioned to write a series of articles in The Listener on what to expect from this newfangled technology called television. What interests me about it is that unlike many of his colleagues and the BPS, of which he was an active member from his undergraduate days onwards, eventually serving as president, Pear, despite his experimental and academic roles, also believed that it was important for psychology to both consider society and to explain psychology to the public, He personally made over 140 radio appearances between 1924 and 1968, but none on television, feeling he lacked the polish required. Psychology in wartime. In 1941, Pear wrote that radio and its relationship with the public was pivotal. He thought it may be the chief maker or breaker of the world's peace. However, he went on to, in the same article, to decry his own profession. The next generation, noting how few present-day psychologists were interested in unemployment, in social and national relationships, in friendship and hatred, how little they did to try and prevent or study war, and how fascinated they were with the study of intelligence, they took no interest in its wise direction, may consider many of the present researchers childishly trivial, tragically irrelevant, and deservedly unpopular. We now come to the second of my influencers. Frederick Laws was a scriptwriter, arts, radio, and literary critic of the News Chronicle, as well as a BPS general member from 1941. His first wife was a psychologist, and Laws often reviewed psychology books in the general press. He contacted George Orwell at the BBC, proposing a series of 6 talks by psychologists. The invoice for Pear's talk states it took place on the 11th of October 1943. Laws also suggested he edited the broadcasts into a public booklet, but this doesn't seem to have happened. Laws was, like Pear, very interested in the influence of radio, publishing his own book, Radio and the Public, in 1947. He gave a talk at the BPS AGM in 1946 on the theory and practice of communication, an early example of media training for psychologists. At the same AGM, Pear gave a paper, Psychologists and War, a Problem in Social Psychology, with yet another call for psychologists to consider and research into contemporary society. Pear was a member of the BPS section for social psychology, which had been formed in 1940. All of the next slide I'm going to come on to kind of brings to head all of the arguments that I posited right at the beginning, which were psychologists versus psychiatrists, academic and applied versus social psychologists, psychologists as society versus psychologists as individuals, and psychologists and the public. In 1945, for the very first time, a statement by the BPS Council appeared in the British Journal of Psychology. This posited definitions of psychology and its different branches, and included, amongst other definitions, psychological medicine, brackets psychiatry, should be used to mean that branch of medicine which is mainly concerned with emotional and other mental disorders. Psychiatrist, a physician who specialises in psychological medicine, brackets psychiatry. It went on to say the following terms, which are often employed, are not necessarily meaningless, but in the opinion of the Council, liable to too much ambiguity and misunderstanding to be used by the Society. Medical psychologist, neuropsychiatrist, academic psychologist, clinical psychologist. The term clinical should be confined to its medical usage. Meekly, the statement said, there is no implication of enforcing, but only of encouraging, the use of terms in accordance with these definitions. The Society was still publishing the British Journal of Medical Psychology, the House Journal of the Medical Section. The following year, in 1946, Thomas Pear, with the help of Frederick Laws, presented a report to the BPS Council which reviewed coverage of psychology in the press and broadcast media since the end of the war. A public relations committee had been set up in 1943 when Pear was president, but had been unable to persuade the council to change its closed policy. Pear argued in this survey that even when psychology was mentioned in the press and radio, there was an emphasis on psychiatry, vocational guidance, and delinquency, and there appeared little about psychology's new ideas and development. He enigmatically suggested the reasons for this imbalance may be connected with the growth of vested interests inside psychology itself. He highlighted in this review that few named psychologists had broadcast, with the exception of himself, Professors Valentine, Flugel and Burt. The official reason given that medics were not allowed to give out their names in the non-medical press was dismissed by Pear as often broken in practice. He suspected that many anonymous writers and broadcasters on psychological matters were not medically qualified, but hiding their lack of professional credentials by this anonymous method. A new society venture, a members' magazine, the Quarterly Bulletin, began in 1948. Frederick Laws was appointed the first editor. Hitherto, the Society had only published academic journals edited by psychologists. In the second issue, which is on your right here, Laws published a follow-up to his and Pear's survey of public relations of psychology, looking at media coverage from 47 to 48. And he wrote, "We are handicapped by not knowing what the public thinks of important psychological issues." He repeated, now to a full membership audience, his critical comments on the issue of anonymity. And he continued that the BBC's presentation of psychology and psychiatry, although limited, had been serious and sensible, but there was very little psychology in the evenings on the popular third programme during this period. The Press and Public Relations Committee was revived in 1955 with Pear again as the chair. The committee undertook a number of studies, including the analysis of over 1,000 press cuttings and reviews of psychologists on television and in the radio, the latter naturally by Pear. Pear reported that the BBC often didn't ask for psychologists when representatives of other specialties took part, and that no mechanisms existed whereby psychological topics were drawn to the attention of the BBC. Dr. Ingham, who was tasked with considering relationships for the committee, commented that medical psychologists, meaning psychiatrists, have more influence than psychologists, and that the public tended to regard medics as experts. And even when psychology was included, it focused on intelligence and psychoanalytic ideas rather than social and practical psychology. Dr. Oppenheim said that television included almost no psychology at all, concluding that this was due to an apparent ignorance by the ITA of the existence of psychologists. In 1956, the committee had settled on 9 recommendations, including 2 related to proposed improvements in relations with medicine and medical psychology, still freely using the non-recommended term. And they also thought there should be a press officer, broader areas of psychology should be covered, that the AGM not only should be broadcast, but there should be BBC audience research to study the reactions to it. There should be a press launch for a recent BPS report on secondary school selection, a films committee, the appointment of an archivist, as well as a permanent or standing press committee reporting to council. Unfortunately, timing is everything, and this was a period when there were many tensions within the society coming to a head. Arguments between academic and practical psychologists, known as those who did psychology and those who ran psychology. The academic psychologists felt that BPS resources should be confined to supporting research. The substantive medical section, which still comprised largely medically qualified members, was also in the midst of a dispute after a prospective non-medical member was rejected by the section. They were also against a proposal to expand the scope of the British Journal of Medical Psychology, responding, "The journal should continue to represent psychology from the medical point of view." The chairman of the medical section stated during an EGM, "At the risk of being called narrow-minded or illiberal, we cannot avoid placing first in this section the very interests for which it was founded." A committee of inquiry of past presidents was formed to consider the scope and membership of the medical section. So in the midst of this, the president contacted the Public Relations Committee, asking them to show tact in their report and recommendations, citing a recent resignation from the council indicating the level of opposition to the kind of proposals under discussion by the committee, and the need to avoid any terminology implying that the society spoke for a profession. Members of the medical section may have had allegiances to other bodies and saw the BPS more closely aligned to its original Learning Society origins. Disappointed, the members of the committee hoped at least to publish in the bulletin the original recommendations, but this had to be agreed by the council and the editor, and Laws had stopped being the editor in 1953, replaced by a psychologist. So the report was not published, although a summary was published in the annual report, focusing on how psychology was misrepresented, research misquoted and misunderstood by the general public and by government departments. No references to medical psychology were included. A medical psychologist, E.B. Strauss, was actually elected president, and the 1957 council decided not to reappoint the committee. And in fact, the only proposals by the PR committee that the council agreed was for the drawing up of a psychology booklet for librarians and the creation of an honorary archivist. I started looking at this topic in the BPS archives because although I knew the first archivist was appointed in the 1950s, I just didn't understand why this would be a resolution of the Public Relations Committee, and actually, in fact, the only successful one. As CODA, the medical section was renamed Medicine and Psychotherapy in 1976, and Psychotherapy section in 1988, and there are currently no medically qualified members of the section and less than 12 medically qualified members of the Society today. In 1965, the Society received its Royal Charter, the first step, it hoped, in the long road towards statutory registration, so that nobody could claim to be a psychologist who had not met certain standards. And there was still quite a way to go, and another charter 20 years later. But what I want to highlight are the changes of the aims of the Society in this 1965 charter. And it has been quoted a couple of times already today. After agreeing to take over the assets of the original organisation, instead of the objective being to promote research, the first objective was to promote the advancement and diffusion of a knowledge of psychology. A subsequent short-lived working party on publicity between 1970 and 1971 trialled press releases for the 1970 annual conference, and they even had a press relaunch on a report on Scientology. They noted that psychology has a poor public image, and this is partly due to the Society's poor public relations system and its policy of press secrecy. However, apart from one of the PAs attached to the BPS Secretariat being designated press officer between 1973 and 1976, very little happened to change the Society's position until 1984, when yet another public relations working party reported. And this was in the era of funding cuts. And the report said that employers and government departments did not fully appreciate the actual and potential benefits of psychology to the nation. There had been a previous report on the effects of austerity a couple of years earlier, or the effects of austerity on the psychology workforce a couple of years earlier, called The Image and the Axe. The driver for both of these reports was for the profession itself to have a better public image in order to have a be more effective in lobbying government and public decision makers. However, the 1984 report did include a chapter called The General Public. Peter Morris, the author, wrote, "They need to know in a general way what psychology can offer, and specifically what psychology advises in certain situations. It probably surprises outsiders that the BPS does not even produce its own publications on how to deal with common events which seem to be directly within the field of psychology." Morris was later to lead on a project called The Benefits of Psychology. The report noted that some members felt it was the responsibility of the Society to be active in promoting psychology, and others felt it was ill-equipped to do so, and that specialist interests were better served by a personal responsibility. Unlike the previous reports and working parties, this one was actually successful, and a press committee was appointed. In 1985, Stephen White, a non-psychologist PR professional, was appointed as the BPS Director of Information, a post he held for over 20 years, and a professional press officer joined him in 1991, and the directorate expanded. Under the governance of a series of committees, communications, press, information, and finally a board, which Graham Davey mentioned this morning, the communications function under White began a more proactive and polished approach to publicity with regular press releases, originally arranged around conferences, the creation of a database of expert members who could comment to the press, and this had 900 members by 1998, regular media training of members, which included a handbook co-authored by Stephen White, let's cover here, coordination of consultation and responses, and a series of proactive briefings and public policy statements to the Parliament and the press. The first of these was the parliamentary launch in March 1985 of a book, The Psychological Aspects of Nuclear War. Another BPS public campaign between 1987 and 1991 was on psychological aspects of disaster, which recommended professional psychological resources to be mandated after disasters, although attempts to introduce legislation via a private member's bill were not successful. The Bulletin was re-envisaged as a magazine, The Psychologist, in 1988, with a column Media Watch, organised by the Press Committee, picking up review of psychology in the press, originally started by Thomas Pear in the 1940s. Stephen White even spent a few years as assistant editor in addition to his other tasks. The Psychologist covered a wide range of professional contemporary issues. One of these, discussed by both the Press Committee and the Psychologist Editorial Committee, was how to cover the psychology of the public relation of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. A press release highlighted a feature in the Psychologist, which was then reported by the Daily Express, Daily Mail, Sunday Times, and Wales on Sunday. Although for the latter, the non-medical consultant psychologist quoted was described as a psychiatrist in the headline. Stephen White began the planning for the BPS Centenary in 1991, and a members' Centenary committee planned and organised a multitude of activities, including public exhibitions and national museums, conferences, lectures, articles, films, BBC recordings, all under a strapline, bringing psychology to society. The Times devoted a double-page spread here to the BPS, quite an upgrade from the notice in 1919 when Myers opened up the society to the public. A montage of a firework display at the annual conference to celebrate the centenary. A coda to the centenary was the Way Ahead Legacy Group, which agreed we must disseminate to the public as well as we disseminate to psychologists. And this led to the annual lectures, involvement in the Edinburgh and Cheltenham festivals. There were also proposals for targeted psychology on the radio, which would have pleased Tom Pear and Frederick Laws. A BPS Media Engagement Award began in 2011. Another legacy of the centenary activities was the creation of the History of Psychology Centre, which promotes awareness and research into the history of psychology to psychologists and to the public, and have organised this event today. Thank you.